Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Regeneration in Coastal Communities, with Fola Malomo from the University of Essex. Today, Fola will discuss the differences in economic trends between coastal areas that have performed well and coastal areas that have been less successful. Fola will speak for about 40 minutes and then he will address your questions at the end. You're able to submit your questions at any time throughout the session via the questions box in the panel on your right. I'll pass you straight over to Fola to get started. So Fola, I'm just going to change presenter now. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Alex. I hope you can see my screen. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending my webinar. Today, I'll be looking at coastal communities, and the title of this webinar is Why Do Some Coastal Communities Rise While Others Decline? Okay, just some housekeeping. This seminar is expected to last for about an hour. I'll present for 40 to 50 minutes with 20 to 10 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them and I'll answer them when I'm able to. Here's a brief outline of everything I expect to cover today. I'm going to go through the motivation of the study and answer the question why people should care about coastal communities. I'm going to look at the current state of affairs in Clacton-on-Sea, which is the area that I'm studying. I'll look at the housing market, the labour market, and the product market in Clacton-on-Sea and in other coastal communities. I'll ask what went wrong, and I'll try to take some lessons from other coastal and non-coastal communities that have managed to regenerate despite experiencing declines. We'll look at different types of coastal communities, and we'll offer some policy proposals, and we'll look at some prospects for the housing, labour, and productivity and product markets. Okay, let's start with the motivation. Why should we care about regeneration in coastal communities? This study was really spurred on by the recent by-election in the constituency of Clacton-on-Sea and the election of the first UKIP MP, which shone a light to the general public and to the media of the relatively fast decline of Clacton-on-Sea in the past 20 years. Towards the end of the 20th century, Clacton relied quite heavily on tourism, which received a negative and permanent demand shock in the 90s due to the provision of cheap foreign holidays. Many commentators have emphasized the fact that the plight of Clacton-on-Sea is not isolated in itself. In reality, the plight of tourism is shared by many coastal communities who depended on the tourist industry in order to promote their economic growth. In 2007, the Select Committee on Coastal Towns was set up by Parliament to better understand what drives the decline of coastal communities, and they came up with these three bullets here. Firstly, the peripheral location and poor transport system and provision, the lack of diversification in the local economy, and low educational attainment by the population in some of these coastal communities, which makes it very difficult to regenerate the economy. And these are the three main things that we'll see in this webinar. Clacton is quite isolated compared to other coastal communities that have risen from their decline. There is a lack of diversification in the local economy because it was heavily reliant on tourism, and the workforce the educated workforce migrated and was replaced by a more elderly workforce or an older population, which made it very difficult to regenerate the economy. Okay, so what is regeneration? The Office for the Deputy Prime Minister defines regeneration as consisting of the holistic process of reversing environmental, social, and economic decline in places where market forces alone are insufficient to do so. And in this webinar, I will be focusing quite a lot on the environmental, social, and economic status of Clacton. But in simple terms, regeneration is just making something that was great, that isn't as great, better. And possibly the best example of regeneration, or some of the best examples of regeneration, are found in Dubai and in coastal areas and communities in Australia, which have changed their specialization from jobs in the traditional fishery industries to product processing industries in order to revitalize their economy. This usually takes a lot of time and commitment from the government and the people, and that's something I'll discuss later on as well. Despite the decline of tourism in areas like Clacton and in other coastal areas in the UK, it's important to note that tourism isn't necessarily in decline globally, or rather, there are areas that thrive and prosper from tourism. There are examples of areas in South America, the United States, and Asia that are doing quite well and benefits quite a lot from tourism. And I have photographs from Bali in Indonesia on the left and Pattaya in Thailand on the right. So there are places that do manage to attract lots of tourists. They usually have a huge conference trade and they still benefit from tourism. Okay, let's talk about the current state of affairs in the UK, in Clacton-on-Sea in particular. There is a tendency to consider the decline of coastal communities irreversible. A report from the Centre for Social Justice indicated that Clacton-on-Sea is in a vicious circle, and poverty and deprivation would only attract more poverty and deprivation, and it would be unable to climb out of that poverty and deprivation. I'm challenging this viewpoint. I'm asking if such a state of affairs is permanent or if it's possible for coastal communities to rise out of their poverty and deprivation. So I want to better understand what happens in coastal communities that do rise out of poverty and deprivation and see if I can apply some of those solutions to Clacton-on-Sea. Although we do realize that each story of economic decline and success is unique with its own idiosyncrasies, we do believe that there are common features that can be provided as lessons for those communities that aren't doing as well as the others. And in this study, I compared the regenerative efforts of Clacton-on-Sea, Brighton and Hove, and Southend-on-Sea. Clacton-on-Sea is positioned within Tendring District, so sometimes I look at Tendring District due to the similarity in the population of Tendring District with the population of Brighton and Hove and Southend-on-Sea. Sometimes I'll discuss Clacton-on-Sea instead of Tendring due to the urban nature of Clacton and the urban nature of Brighton and Hove and areas in Southend-on-Sea. At the bottom here, to the left, there's a picture of the pier in Clacton. The middle picture is of the pier in Southend, the longest pier in Europe, I believe, and on the right is the pier in Brighton. Okay, I just want to show you where these areas are located. In the left image, we have the county of Essex, which houses Clacton-on-Sea to the northeast, below the port of Harwich, and Southend-on-Sea to the southeast, closer to London. Immediately from this image, we can get a view of why Clacton-on-Sea hasn't developed as well as Southend-on-Sea. One of the comments that I mentioned earlier was transport links. If you look at Southend-on-Sea, it's very close to an airport. It has Southend Airport, which is an international airport. It has good rail links into London and into the East Anglia area. And it also has good road links. The A127 and the A13 connect it to other areas outside of Southend-on-Sea. Comparing that to Clacton-on-Sea tells us a lot. There's one road that goes into Clacton-on-Sea. There's only one rail line that goes into Clacton-on-Sea. Despite there being an airfield, there's no international airport that it can benefit from. So we can get a view of the isolated nature on Clacton-on-Sea compared to Southend-on-Sea and other areas. And this is one of the reasons why we think it hasn't done as well as it should have done and as other areas have done. So it has no international airport, the road links are quite limited, and the rail links are quite limited as well. Brighton is directly below London, and it is well connected compared to Clacton-on-Sea. There's the A23, which connects to the M23, which connects to London, and the M25. There is the A27, which goes from west to east and east to west, which links it to Hastings to the east and to Portsmouth in the west. There's also Shoreham Airfield and Gatwick Airport, which is half an hour's drive away from Brighton and Hove, which connects it to the international community. So Brighton and Hove is well connected. Southend-on-Sea is well connected. Clacton-on-Sea is not as well connected as the other two. Okay, here's another set of diagrams that tells us about the plight of Clacton-on-Sea. These diagrams show the index of multiple deprivation for Brighton and Hove, Southend-on-Sea, and Tendring, respectively. And the index of multiple deprivation in this case is concerning education, skills, and training. Without looking at the maps, we can get a view of the level of deprivation in terms of education and skills in these areas just by looking at the legend. The legend compares the local level of deprivation, the least level of deprivation being related to the most affluent areas and the most deprivation being related to the least affluent areas, to the national levels of deprivation in education, skills and training. And we can see that the richest areas in Brighton and Hove are similar in terms of education and skills and training to the richest areas nationally. And the poorest areas in Brighton and Hove are similar to the poorest areas nationally. And whilst the range may be slightly smaller in Southend-on-Sea, the story is generally the same. If we were to take a crude, simple average of these areas, we would obtain an average that's similar to the national average. Even though the richest areas in Southend are less rich than the richest areas nationally, and the poorest areas are less poor than the poorest areas nationally, it's not that big of a difference. In general, it's the same. However, in Clacton, something different seems to be the case. The richest areas are significantly less rich than the richest areas nationally, and the poorest areas are in line with the poorest areas nationally. We'd expect the poorest areas to be in line with the poorest areas nationally due to the classification of Jaywick as being one of the most deprived, or the most deprived area in the United Kingdom a few years ago. So that's not surprising, but the fact that the richest areas are in the 60th to 80th percentiles of income compared to the richest areas nationally is quite striking and tells you a lot about the level of deprivation in this area. If we were to take a simple average of this, it would be a lot more deprived, a lot poorer than the national average. So that's without looking at the diagram. That's just, oops. That's just looking at the legend. If we take a look at the diagram, we can see that the deprivation in Brighton and Hove is located towards the outskirts of Brighton and Hove, going towards the university in areas like Whitehawk and Moulscombe. In Southend-on-Sea, we have areas that are relatively deprived both above and below the London Road, in Westcliff-on-Sea and Chalkwell. In the Tendring district, there's deprivation in Clacton-on-Sea and around Clacton-on-Sea, especially in Jaywick and Seawick. Despite this, there are affluent areas in the Tendring district around Clacton-on-Sea, especially Frinton-on-Sea and Holland. But the deprivation is a lot greater than the affluence, which is why we're doing the study and what we're trying to figure out. Okay, an important year is 1980 when looking at Clacton-on-Sea. The economic decline of Clacton started in 1980, and it was due to the fact that the only industry which supported the local economy was hit by a permanent and negative demand shock as foreign tourism became cheaper and more affordable. And since then, there has been no significant attempt to diversify the local economy when the decline of the tourist industry became evident. The active working population largely left, and they were replaced by senior citizens. The demand for housing from these senior citizens lowered house prices in Clacton-on-Sea, with the result that many good houses have been underpriced, so the house market isn't as strong as it was. A lot of the jobs that are available are for unskilled workers, and they are seasonal. Excuse me. Migration from the EU is also seasonal, and there's a lot of competition between migrant workers and local workers for the same stock of unskilled jobs in the area. Despite this, there are plans from the council. These include developing sectors with a strong growth potential, including health and care. Some of the largest hospitals in Essex are more inland, but it's arguable that there's a higher level of demand for healthcare in regions such as Clacton-on-Sea and Jaywick. Other investments of the council include investments on the seafront, sea defences, cliff walks, and retail, and I'll go through those in this webinar. Okay, other important dates to note are November 2013, when the council developed and approved the economic development strategy for the district. This strategy identified the sectors and the areas that together might have the most positive impact on the district's economy. In April 2014, parts of the district were given assisted area status, and in response to this, the council developed and launched its SME Growth Fund Scheme, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Growth Fund Scheme, in order to support new and established businesses that are located in or moving to the designated area. And this scheme focuses on providing help for businesses in manufacturing, engineering, energy, low carbon, maritime, research and development, and supply chain management. And it's hoped that this scheme will complement the Centre of Offshore Renewable Engineering status, which was awarded to Harwich and Brightlingsea in 2014. Also worthy of attention is the £36 million coastal defence project, which began in 2014 and saw the creation of 23 new beaches along a 5-kilometre stretch of coastline from Clacton-on-Sea to Holland Haven. And this investment will provide, or is hoped to provide, many commercial opportunities in relation to the new beaches that were created and the protected land around it. Okay, when doing this study and looking at coastal communities, I wanted to do something that was helpful to Clacton, and I also wanted to do something that was helpful to coastal communities in general. So I'm looking at 3 main areas in this study: Clacton-on-Sea, Brighton-on-Hove, and Southend-on-Sea. But I wanted to see if I could extrapolate some of my solutions to coastal areas in general in the UK and globally. So I sought after a model that might help me do this, and I found the typology of coastal communities that was created by the Marine Management Organization. And they basically classify or categorize coastal communities into different segments based on their demographic, economic, and geographic characteristics, from those areas that are highly specialized in retirement areas, those that are less affluent, and those that are characterized by high levels of economic activity. Just to give you some information on the coastal communities that I'm looking at in this study, this table shows labour, industry and housing variables for Clacton-on-Sea, Brighton-on-Hove and Southend-on-Sea, and it shows whether the areas are above coastal averages or below coastal averages. And immediately we can see the nature of the labour market in Clacton-on-Sea due to its high share of people of pensionable age in part-time employment, home working, in self-employment and in tourism, which isn't necessarily good for regeneration. When you want to regenerate an economy, you need people of working age, you need people in full-time employment, you need people who aren't just employed in tourism. Also notable are the statistics for Jaywick, which shows a high level of people receiving job seekers allowance compared to the coastal average, incapacity benefits, living allowance claimants, disability living allowance claimants, and living with a long-term illness. So that's not good for regeneration. We can see the difference between the different coastal areas in terms of housing as well. Southend-on-Sea and Brighton generally have a higher level of people living in dwellings with 8 rooms or more. Mobility is quite high in the housing sector as well, and people are willing and able to travel long distances to work due to the improved transport links. Okay, looking at housing from another viewpoint, I've put a graph showing median house prices based on land registry data in Southend-on-Sea, Tendring and Brighton and Hove from 1996 to 2013. and we can see a clear rise in the level of, or in the house prices from 1996 to 2008. And there's a drop in 2008 and 2009 associated with the economic crisis of the same period. And there has been a rise in the house prices in Brighton Hove since then, and a rise in the house prices in Southend since then, but not so in Tendring. And this is worrying. This is the reason why we're doing the study. We want to know why Brighton and Southend have been able to bounce back from their decline, but Tendring does not seem to have bounced back from its decline. Important to note is that the trend in house prices between Tendring and Southend was very similar before 2008. So we're not comparing areas that were experiencing different outcomes. We're comparing areas that were experiencing similar outcomes in terms of the level and growth of house prices from 1996 to 2008. But whereas there's a somewhat U-shape in the graph for Southend-on-Sea, there is what looks like a backwards L-shaped trend for Tendring. This shows that the decline in coastal regions, or the plight of coastal regions, or the plight of these areas has been experienced by coastal regions and non-coastal regions. This graph shows the change over time in unemployment claimant levels, which rose around 2008 and 2009, in line with the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. So what we're showing isn't something that's specific to Clacton-on-Sea, Brighton and Hove, or Southend-on-Sea. This is experienced by both coastal and non-coastal regions as well. But some areas have been able to climb out of the plight, other areas have not. Also of interest is productivity. I looked at a few productivity indicators, including the employment in the knowledge industry, the level of business stock, business births, and business deregistrations. And the data for Clacton shows a lower level of people, or a lower share of people employed in the knowledge industry compared with Brighton and Southend. If we want to regenerate Clacton, if we want to improve economic outcomes, it helps to have people involved in industries that seek to gain expertise from higher education, from technical fields, and it would help Clacton-on-Sea to increase the level of people employed in the knowledge industry by attracting technical experts, by attracting high-skilled labor, if it wants to see increases in productivity in line with Southend-on-Sea and Brighton. Whilst the business stock per 10,000 of population might be higher than in Brighton and Southend, not too much should be put into this statistic. Firstly, because the population is probably smaller. Secondly, because the type of businesses that are present within Clacton are probably very small businesses, and they employ low-skilled workers mainly. In addition to this, it's important to understand that if Clacton wishes to regenerate, it needs to increase the level of VAT registrations, business startups, business births, in line with or higher than Brighton and Southend-on-Sea. Whilst business survival is higher in Clacton than Brighton and Southend-on-Sea, it needs to diversify the level of businesses in line with my previous comments concerning the type of labor it employs and the type of businesses that it has. So this statistic shows that whilst the number of businesses starting up in Clacton is lower, the number of businesses that are failing are also lower, which is good. So this statistic is good, but it could benefit from better statistics here, and concerning knowledge in the knowledge industry. Okay, so we've talked about the decline of tourism, we've talked about the labor market, we've talked about deprivation in terms of the out-migration of the economically active population and the inward migration of the elderly population. Also of importance is the fact that despite the influx or despite the provision of cheap foreign holidays, despite people choosing to go abroad instead of to Clacton-on-Sea for their holidays, many coastal communities sought conference bookings and benefited from the conference trade, which was quite useful on the weeks on the periphery of the tourism season. If you go to Brighton, you'll see the Brighton Centre, you'll see the Brighton Dome. Southend will see benefits from the university campus that's there, and many coastal communities across the world engage in the conference trade. They have massive conference centres which attracts businesses, which attracts professionals, which attracts academics in order to engage in conferences. This is something that Clacton-on-Sea didn't do. Clacton lost its big hotels. Many of the large properties were converted into houses of multiple occupancy, and it also chose not to invest in new conference centres, which wasn't good in terms of its economic outcomes. Another concern is the stock of houses. A concern from regeneration is the perceived future likelihood of the local residents. Traditionally, regeneration is associated with gentrification that's beneficial to young and upwardly mobile professionals, but detrimental to the lesser off incumbent residents of an area. And I spoke to the regeneration team in East London, which helped with the regeneration around the London Olympics. And this was their concern as well. Sometimes incumbent residents are offered housing that's far away from their home, causing them to have to find new schools for their children, which can be a pain because sometimes the schools are full up, causing them to find new amenities, causing them to have to increase their transport costs if they live close to where they work. And this is an issue for people who are living in an area that's about to undergo serious regeneration. In other cases, the new houses that are built are too expensive for the incumbent residents to purchase or rent. So central to the regeneration of Clacton will be the provision of new affordable housing for both young and upwardly mobile professionals and local residents. So whilst house prices are important for the welfare of an area, the stock of housing is also important for successful regeneration to take place. Okay, one thing that really struck me when I was doing this study was the provision of higher education institutions. Brighton has the University of Brighton, it has a musical college there, it has Brighton College. It's closely affiliated with the University of Sussex. Right, there were over 20,000 students at the University of Brighton alone in 2009. Southend has the University of Essex campus, which has about 1,000 students. And we know from the literature that higher education institutions play a significant role in economic development, regeneration, and promoting stable communities. Clacton-on-Sea does not have a comparable institution to promote sustainable communities, economic development, or regeneration. The Colchester Institute is located in Clacton-on-Sea, but the numbers are nowhere near the numbers that we've seen for Brighton and Southend. Considering the fact that universities had an average income of over £180 million in 2012-2013, this should be an important point for Clacton to look at when it considers how best to regenerate. Universities employ people, but they also provide employment in other industries, in other areas, for example, real estate, housing, construction, and retail. And so a university can be a huge attractor of economic development and regeneration. Okay, this is a picture of East London, Stratford. The top picture is of Stratford before the London Olympics and before the regeneration surrounded the London Olympics. And the bottom picture is Stratford after the London Olympics. And I put this picture there, and if you've read the paper, I included East London because I believe that coastal areas can take lessons from non-coastal areas when it comes to regeneration. In East London, in order to prepare the city for the Olympics, a 175,000 square meter retail and leisure development, Westfield Stratford City, which is towards the center of this picture, was created. This allowed for hotel developments. This allowed for over 100,000 square meters of office space, over 1,000 meters of residential developments, and this encouraged regeneration and gentrification in the area. Clacton can also benefit from investment into retail and leisure. Large shopping centres usually help to publicise an area and encourage businesses to set up in an area. Also important is the fact that businesses benefited from being located close to the financial hub of the city and Canary Wharf, and that Stratford benefited from good transport links into London and into Essex. So that's another point to re-emphasize the importance of transport in regeneration. And that's what this slide says. Okay. We can also take lessons from coastal regions when trying to regenerate areas like Clacton. Current regeneration policies are based on housing-led regeneration, the provision of infrastructure, economic renewal, neighborhood renewal, and similar initiatives. Gentrification often occurs as a result of regeneration programs that are sponsored by the state, so it's important for the state to play a major role in regeneration. Demolished property is often purchased from owners for a price that's set by the local government using a legal instrument called a compulsory purchase order. Despite this, after regeneration takes place, as previously said, many owners found that the amount that they received is not worth as much as the new values of the property in the area, of the properties in the area. And so steps should be taken to make sure that the incumbent residents of an area are not worse off as a result of regeneration. There are fiscal incentives to subsidize construction and the renovation of houses. And this data suggests that this can be successful in regenerating the area, reducing population decline, increasing the stock of housing, and increasing short-term employment generation. It's important for coastal areas to build economies which are not dependent on tourism or welfare. One thing we found from looking at the study is that the examples of successful generation usually combine efforts from the private sector and the public sector. That suggests that cross-organizational cooperation is important for successful coastal regeneration. An improved commitment from both the public and private sectors is important in order to get effective regeneration, and that's seen in the UK and outside of the UK as well. Funding is available from outside sources, but it usually requires matching from either the local government or the private sector. And I identified a number of industries that are lacking in Clacton compared to Brighton and Southend, and some of them are being looked at by the council: manufacturing, financial industry, the real estate sector, public admin, and defence. Notably, both Brighton and Southend have at least one huge financial institution present within the region, but Clacton does not, so it might benefit from attracting a bank or attracting a financial firm in order to help the local businesses grow. Okay, policy proposals. I have general policy proposals and specific policy proposals. As I said before, Clacton should reduce its reliance on tourism for its economic produce. Regeneration is an ambitious task. It's important to not rely on one sector or one area. In general, it should try to diversify its stock. It has to use specific improvements. So I've talked about the coastal defense scheme. I've mentioned transport. I will mention more specific improvements that it can do later, but it should try to develop alternative industries and sectors. It should increase the percentage of people with a degree to levels similar to that in areas like Brighton. I think the level is currently 15.9%, and it could and should be much higher. Only 15.9% of people in Tendrick have a level 4 qualification or higher. The figure for Southend-on-Sea is 21.8%. I've suggested 28.5% in order to significantly increase the level of employment and the level of skill of the population. Also useful is a massive increase of the percentage of people employed in the knowledge industry. A lot of these proposals are related to each other, so they're not just random proposals. If you invest in higher education and try to attract people with a degree, this will help spur the knowledge industry. In Southend-on-Sea, you see lots of startups, you see lots of people involved in the tech industry approaching Brighton rather, not Southend-on-Sea, Brighton. So a lot of these solutions and a lot of these policy proposals are interlinked and related to each other. Tendering should also try to reduce its reliance on the public sector for funding. This is in order to improve resilience against future recessions and cuts in government spending. Under austerity, it becomes relatively difficult to regenerate, and it should try to seek alternative funding sources in order to do so. I mentioned startups. Despite the high number of businesses in Clacton, it has the lowest level of startups out of the 3 areas that I've discussed. And in order to boost productivity, it should try to make the percentage of VAT registrations at least 10% of the total business population. I mean, this is a target. If it were able to achieve this target, it would be in line with Southend-on-Sea and Brighton and Hove. Just to take another look at housing, overall the value of the average house that was sold in Clacton-on-Sea a couple of years ago was half the value of the average house sold in Brighton, and the growth rate in the prices of houses was just over half that in Brighton. And that really shows you the extent of the plight in Clacton-on-Sea. The house prices in Clacton-on-Sea are also significantly less than those found in Southend-on-Sea, and the growth rate is less. So both the level and the growth rate is lower than that found in Southend-on-Sea and Brighton. I'm not suggesting that Clacton-on-Sea try to compete with Southend-on-Sea and Brighton. What I am saying is that considering the image we saw of the trend in house prices, where we saw Clacton-on-Sea having similar outcomes to Southend-on-Sea and Brighton, it would make sense to try to improve its housing market and try to make housing better and more easily available for all. Okay, we've already seen the picture of the labour market. Moving on to productivity. Whereas the level of births or the number of births of businesses in tendering is lower than Brighton and Hove and Southend-on-Sea, the survival is much better than Southend-on-Sea. So we see that tendering consistently does better than Southend-on-Sea in terms of its business survival, and over the course of 5 years it does significantly better than Southend-on-Sea and very similarly to Brighton and Hove. So that's something that's positive and something that it can take into the future in order to look at its prospects. Okay, as mentioned at the beginning, this study analyzes regeneration in terms of both the social aspect, the economic aspect, and the environmental aspects. Central to the social aspect of regeneration are the instruments that attract a better qualified workforce. These are housing, recreational facilities, and shopping facilities. Central to regeneration in Clacton is the provision of affordable housing for local residents and young and upwardly mobile professionals that work in places like London. Areas like East London benefited from the creation of the Olympic Park, which allowed for recreational facilities that are used for major events. Brighton's American Express Stadium is home to its local football club and hosts non-sporting events as well. Clacton can benefit from something similar. Also, Brighton and Southend have regenerated areas of shopping malls with trendy retail outlets. The creation of the same in Clacton can attract businesses and give both old and new residents a place to spend their money. Concerning economic regeneration, as mentioned before, the inter and intra-transport system can be improved to attract companies. Regeneration usually requires improving the connectivity of an environment to outside places. We've seen that in East London. We've seen the connectivity available in Brighton Hove and in Southend-on-Sea. And the same also applies to Clacton. Better use of the international port of Harwich can also help with regeneration in Clacton. Also, we've seen that jobs can create opportunities for local residents and attract new residents to move to Clacton. I mentioned the fact that Brighton and Southend house major financial firms, American Express and the Royal Bank of Scotland. Clacton can benefit from seeking to do the same to provide opportunities for its local residents and to provide business advice for local businesses. It's also important to consider the environmental side of regeneration. The reclamation of derelict land in Jaywick creates space for regeneration of housing. Also, the planting of trees and the creation of areas of open space can help create an environment that people wish to live in, which will attract more people. Okay, that is my conclusion. I am happy to take questions. I believe we have about 16 minutes left for questions.
Thank you, Fola. Yes, we have had a question come through. If in the meantime anyone else would like to ask a question, then please do submit it in the questions box on the panel on your right. So, Fola, many smaller and mid-sized declining cities also adopt culture-led regeneration strategies, which often involve building a flagship cultural facility along the lines of the Creative City strategy. Is that something that coastal towns have done, and any lessons from that?
Okay, thank you for that question. I can't see who wrote the question, but many of the environments, many of the coastal communities and many non-coastal communities regenerate around a strategy, around a culture-led strategy. In East London, it was based on the Olympics. What you usually see in these instances is that there is a huge event, so there's usually a huge push that results in this regeneration, that results in the cultural strategy, which connects many aspects of regeneration. It's useful to build a facility, but again, it shouldn't be too connected to one industry or one feature like tourism, for example, in Clacton. It helps to create a culture-led strategy or a culture-led facility that is rather diverse and can be flexible in terms of being used by different segments or different aspects of regeneration. Clacton has done things to improve its culture. It has done things to try to increase the profile of Clacton-on-Sea. There have been documentaries on Clacton-on-Sea. People have looked at the culture of Clacton-on-Sea. However, I would say that people don't necessarily move to Clacton-on-Sea um, based necessarily on the culture. The culture needs to be done alongside the economic strategy, right? So people want to go to good environments, but people also want to have jobs. Um, it's something that is a long-term thing. Culture isn't something that changes overnight. It's not something that you can fund one day and have the benefits from the next day. Culture involves rules, customs, and norms that change slowly and that are affected by both the incumbent residents and the incoming residents. Um, so to answer your question, Clacton is engaged in the culturalist strategy, but it's not something that is going to be done immediately, and it's not something that we will see the effects of immediately due to the nature of culture and due to the nature of regeneration. Regeneration is costly in terms of time, money, and commitment, and in a changing political environment, the path of culture can change. I think that question came from Arwell Jones.
We've had another question come through, Fola.
Okay.
What about the issue of seasonality?
Okay. Many coastal areas had seasonal economies. Um, the idea with regeneration is to try to reduce the seasonality of the economy, either reduce it or to reduce the negative impacts on seasonality on an economy. Um, some of the initiatives I've mentioned aren't based on tourism or aren't seasonal. For example, the Coastal Defence Scheme, the development of 5 kilometers of beaches, education, for example. These are things that, when done properly and when invested in, aren't negatively affected by shocks such as cheap foreign holidays or the outward migration of some economically active individuals. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. Seasonality is important. We need to try to, or Clacton needs to try to find ways of creating a robust economy that can withstand seasonal variation of tourism and things like that. And many of the schemes, including power schemes, the wind power farm, does that. It provides permanent, non-temporary, non-seasonal employment, non-temporary, non-seasonal economic growth for the region, which will be carried forward into the future. So I submitted this paper to a journal and they really liked it, but they wanted me to do more concerning power. Those of you who know Essex will know that the Bradwell nuclear power station was decommissioned. Those of you who know Clacton will have seen the wind farm off the coast of Clacton. So that's one prospect. Hydroelectricity, wind power, and solar power. Such initiatives don't rely on seasonal variations in economic activity. So it's important to get permanent answers, permanent initiatives, permanent solutions to Clacton's plight. And I mean, just relying less on tourism reduces the impact of seasonality on regeneration and economic development. Thank you.
Thanks, Fola. So I think we've got time for just one more question. So you use Southend as an example of an area that has been more successful. I'm aware that there are several areas in Southend, both along the coast and within the town, that have struggled and taken many years to be redeveloped. It seems that areas that the council dedicate themselves to, such as Southend's Golden Mile along the seafront, improve quickly, but other areas have sat empty for a long time after businesses have closed down. Does more need to be done to encourage the private sector to fill in these gaps once the council has spent its money on the big ticket improvement projects? And relating this back to Clacton, if the council spend a great deal of money on some of the suggested improvements, it can't improve everything. So how can it keep the momentum going for continuous improvement?
Um, in relation to South End is a very diversified area. I mean, the question mentions some of the good areas and some of the bad areas. If you go down to Leon Sea, which is towards the west, um, below London Road, you'll see affluent areas. You'll see large houses. You see places with minimal levels of deprivation, basically. On the other hand, if you take a walk down certain areas towards the east, it used to be the case that if you look down the high street, you'd um, guess that Southend wasn't doing so well. Um, the area has benefited from the university. There's no doubt about that. It's benefited in terms of businesses, it's benefited in terms of employment. If you look at housing, the prices are going up. And that's across the board in Southend. So whilst there might be areas that don't necessarily benefit from the big ticket projects, in terms of housing, things are improving. In terms of labour and employment, things are improving. And Southend benefits from its Southend Airport. We are currently looking at what causes businesses to locate in and around Southend and what causes businesses to thrive in and around Southend. I haven't completed that study yet, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the nuances of that study. But the question is right to bring up the fact that not every area benefits equally in terms of regeneration. Not every area has benefited recently in terms of regeneration. I think the important thing is that Southend has a relatively strong community. I did recent work concerning all areas within Essex, and one of the features of a strong community is its ability to redistribute wealth and redistribute the benefits of economic development towards all members of the society. And this comes from things like volunteering, this comes from things like community development projects. And with a strong community, the benefits of regeneration, even if they are led by big ticket items, will benefit the lesser off areas. In terms of Clacton, Clacton is a very interesting area too. It's an area that has deprivation, but it's surrounded by areas that have less deprivation. And the question asked how to maintain the level of regeneration and the level of development in Clacton. It's not a simple, well, it requires a lot of will. I mean, the first map I showed you concerning the location of Clacton and the other areas says a lot. Transport needs to be improved. We did a focus group recently, and many of the members of the panel who were talking about transport in Essex said that it's sometimes easier to get from London to East Anglia than it is to get from areas in London, between London and Clacton. Transport definitely needs to be improved. Once you are connected to an environment, you benefit from the labour, from the economic development, and from the growth in that environment. And I think the most important thing for Clacton, if it wants to sustain its regeneration and if it wants to continue to benefit from the economic development, is to improve its transport links. That means improving the service from the rail line, building new roads. I know it's already done work on the roads in Clacton and in Jaywick. They've been repaved, they've been redeveloped. If it wants to sustain its economic development and growth, it needs to maintain its connectivity both to London, to other areas in Essex, and to areas around Essex. That, for me, is one of the main things.
Thank you, Fola. Leading on from that point, do you see the Crossrail, the work obviously that's going on in London at the moment, as improving the regeneration and making central London more accessible from Clacton?
Crossrail is an interesting project. I've spoken to a few individuals in Transport for London. I see Crossrail as mainly being beneficial to people who live and work in London and people who live and work in the area around London. I think Crossrail is a good thing. I don't think Clacton-on-Sea or its residents should rely on Crossrail for economic regeneration or development. Um, whilst there are benefits to Crossrail, and whilst it's going to improve transport and connectivity, I think Clacton should think about its connectivity not only to London but to other areas within Essex. Um, Recent data suggests that it's sometimes easier to get from places in London to Essex than to move around Essex, which is not necessarily a good thing because there is a lot of potential within Essex and in the areas around Clacton to develop. I mentioned before that Clacton is surrounded by affluent areas, but it hasn't benefited from the affluence in those areas. If it focuses more on the connectivity between, say, Clacton and Colchester, or Clacton and the other areas in Tendring, I think it's more likely to benefit from the economic development in those areas. Um, if Yeah, Clacton should look at not just the railway, it should look at its roads, it should look at air transport, it should look at sea transport. So it shouldn't just look at the things coming out of London. I mean, what comes out of London in terms of Crossrail is fantastic, is good, but transport is multidimensional and it needs to be addressed in all its different dimensions, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thanks, Fola. So that's all that we've got time for today. So thank you for joining the webinar, and we hope you've all enjoyed it. And thank you to Fola for such an informative and engaging presentation there. The slides will be made available on our website soon, so if you would like a copy, then please go onto our website. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.